So you've heard of Tobie's horror stories building this application, right? With various interoperability issues across all the different APIs, and while the testing effort that I'm leading at W3C right now is actually trying to fix that problem. So my name is Tobie Langel. I'm actually a Facebook employee. I'm doing a fellowship. And so I'm working full-time on testing. I thought I would have more time, so I have this whole blog about me. The point I'm trying to make with this is that my background is being a front-end developer. I was working on the prototype JavaScript library, so I've spent a lot of time dealing with IE6 issues. Once with the new browsers coming up, Chrome and Mozilla speeding their development cycles up, IE going back into building new browsers, I kind of had the hope that this whole interoperability issue was kind of like over and we could actually start just working on applications. And it turned out that then there was the mobile web. And that started with all the new APIs, basically being able to build like fully blown applications on mobile devices. We start having a much more complex platform, and thus, again, interop issues. So the current state of browser testing, basically you have what I call grassroots efforts. You have the working group test suites, and then you have with the browser vendors, right? Some of which are open source. So if we look at each of those a bit more in detail, by grassroots efforts, I'm talking about things like, can I use Ringmark, which is actually a project that I led when I was at Facebook, HTML5 test, etc. And the problem with all of these test suites is that they basically only do, or mainly do feature detection. The working group test suites, what they focus on is actually enabling us proving basically that a specification can be implemented. They're not really focusing on making sure that the implementations implement the spec correctly. And also a lot of specs are not yet at recommendation status and don't really have test suites at this point. And then you have the browser vendor test suites. And so that's a great, there's lots of great contributions from vendors so far. But there's little sharing of tests between the different browsers. There was no common test framework until quite recently, so there's lots of legacy content that's kind of hard to integrate. And for some vendors, the tests are not really organized per specs. So it's really hard to kind of find out about the real spec coverage. And then, of course, not all browsers are open source. So all of this leads to what I like to call meh interoperability, which is like it kind of works, the feature's there, but then you have to do all these crazy hacks to make it actually work. And that leads to death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Which is developers spend a crazy amount of time dealing with all these different glitches. And so this is why W3C decided to launch this new testing effort with the goal of actually focusing on testing how the browsers, the user agents, implement the specs. And with the idea to really improve interoperability between the different browsers. So the scope of this effort right now is depth-wise to make sure that the user agents implement the specs correctly. And in terms of breadth, so what we're going to look like, the specs we're going to look like, we're focusing on the union of the core mob and web and TV profiles. Basically, this is the basic kind of set of specifications that you need to write full web applications like the Cormo camera, for example. That looks like, depending on what your background is, it can look like, oh, this is like just a small step, but this is a massive undertaking. And so it is a massive undertaking. So it's quite a big challenge in itself. So who here already wrote W3C tests? No, not that many of you, but some of you. So for those who did and who are not part of W3C working group, this is a non-trivial undertaking. Right? It's difficult to understand where the test suites are located. The documentation is scarce. And these are things that over the last, I would say, year, have started to dramatically change. And so in order to pursue that change, we have a plan that basically looks at infrastructure and at test development. So infrastructure-wise, we've started moving all existing W3C test suites, well, not all of them, most of them on a single repository on GitHub. So initially that was only the HTML working group test suites that were there, and then the web apps working group joined, and then DAP joined, web performance I think is going to join pretty soon. And so it's starting to be the place to go to find W3C tests and to offer them. The second thing that we're doing is we're streamlining the test contribution and review processes. And using GitHub and Git tools is actually a big part of streamlining that process. And then we have lots of future plans, which are to build tools to simplify the test review, because that currently is a big part of the work. And we'd like to make that as lightweight as possible. Same for documentation. Up until now, most working groups had their own documentation and processes for writing and submitting tasks and reviewing them, and we're trying to consolidate all of that in the same place. We're also planning to build this new test framework to make it easy to run tests and collect test results. Making test results easily accessible to developers so they actually know what browser supports the feature that they need to build their application, to see if it makes, for example, business sense to actually build the application that they want to build. Or find out if they have an issue that this actually is not an issue with their app, but with a specific browser. And then, of course, testing is really important, but what's more important is to help the browser vendors improve their browsers as much as possible and as fast as possible. So we want to make sure that it's easy for the browser vendors to integrate this test suite into their own environment so that they can run it and figure out what tests are passing, what tests are not. So the test development-wise. If you look at the union of the two specifications, the two profiles I mentioned, that's a lot of specs. And actually getting full tests for all of these is, as I said, a serious undertaking. And we're looking at 4 ways right now to actually get tests written for these specs. Well, of course, we're counting on more and continuous browser vendor contributions. We're looking more and more at crowdsourcing this effort through events like we had today, Testable Forward events. And then we're looking at outsourcing, and that requires, obviously, funding. And we're looking at also having developers do the same thing that I'm doing, really, which is W3C fellowships to try and to help actually author tests. So, how you can help this effort, because this effort will need everyone's help. Well, first of all, as a developer, you can learn how to write tests, how to review tests, and you can contribute to this effort. And I know some of you have been doing that today, and that's great. So one of the things that we want to do in the future is expose the data that we have from running tests on the test results, for example. And there are really cool tools that can be built on top of this. So, for example, I'm imagining a product that's more fine-grained, for example, than can I use, but would have like this really awesome user interface for web developers to quickly figure out, what browsers has what feature, for example, or what kind, like how many users actually have access to a device that has, say, HTML media capture, for example. Then all of the tools that we're in the process of building are going to be open source. So we also help to improve those tools. And finally, of course, you can, if you're working for the W3C member or not, actually, and you think that you can convince your employer that this is a really key project for the web, then helping with funding or W3C fellows is something that would also be tremendously useful. Okay, that's all I got.